Hey everybody, this video is called The Final Rebellion of the First Generation. And tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of Numbers chapter 25, where we're going to look at Israel's sin with Moab. So chapter 25 verses 1 through 3 starting out. This is going to be a very short chapter. It says, "Now Israel remained in Acacia Grove, and the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate, and they bowed down to their gods. So Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel." So we see this chapter is looking at Israel's final failure before the takeover of Canaan occurred in the plains of Moab. And later on in chapter 31 verse 16, you're going to see the incident was brought about by the council of Balaam. So it doesn't say it specifically here, but we know we covered in chapters 22 through 24 on the false prophet of Balaam. And the Acacia Grove was in the region across the Jordan River from Jericho, where Israel invaded the land of Canaan. And Israel engaged in, we see, acts of sexual immorality with the woman of Moab. And since this was part of the pagan cult that was worshipped by the Moabites, the Israelites joined in the idolatrous practices. So that's why you see with their sexual sin here that they're being charged with idolatry as well. And the Israelites, they yoked themselves to the false gods of the Moabites and the Midianites, which was referred to as Baal of Peor. And we know this was a violation of the first commandment. And Baal was the greatest Canaanite fertility god. In verse 4 and 5 says, "And the Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and hang the offenders before the Lord out in the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel." So Moses said to the judges of Israel, "Every one of you kill his men who were joined to Baal of Peor." So we see that God has called for a severe judgment openly of these offenders who committed these abominous acts. And we see that part of their punishment was to also instill fear among the people that you have provoked the wrath of God, and this is not acceptable conduct. In verse 6 through 10, it says, "And indeed one of the children of Israel came and presented to his brethren a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses, and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Now when Phinehas, I believe his name is, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose from among the congregation and took a javelin in his hand. And he went after the man of Israel into the tent, and thrust both of them through the man of Israel, and the woman through her body. So the plague was stopped among the children of Israel. And those who died in the plague were 24,000. So Phinehas was one among Israel who wouldn't accept this rebellion that was taking place among them against God. And he brought God's judgment by thrusting a spear through this Israelite man and Midianite woman while they were committing this act of sexual immorality. And they were having, likely they were having intercourse in front of the tabernacle. That's what one rabbi during this time period stated. And Phinehas, he takes a stand for righteousness. And we see that there's a plague announced here, that the plague, there were 24,000 people who died. And I wonder if Balak felt accomplished as Israel cursed themselves. We see that Balaam didn't even need to bring a curse upon Israel. Israel fell themselves. And keep in mind that this is a separate account than the 23,000 who had died in the plague over the golden calf. So this is a separate 24,000. So 47,000 people total in number die in Israel because of their open rebellion against the Lord. In verse 10 through 13 it says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the children of Israel, because he was zealous with my zeal among them, so that I did not consume the children of Israel in my zeal. Therefore say, Behold, I give to him my covenant of peace, and it shall be to him and his descendants after him a covenant of an everlasting priesthood, because he was zealous for his God, and he made atonement for the children of Israel." So we see that Phinehas is a man that had a zeal for God. He was very passionate about the things of God and God's holiness. And the Lord made a covenant with him that was an everlasting priesthood with him. And so that though his family line, through his family line, he would come, through his family line would come all future and legitimate priests, high priests. And David speaks about him, and we see a courageous action in Psalm chapter 16, verse 30 and 31. But something that we should get out of Phinehas is that he was very passionate about God's holiness. He was a man after God's own heart. In verse 14 through 18, which wraps up the chapter, like I said, it's short, says, "Now the name of the Israelite who was killed with the Midianite woman, was Zimri, the son of Salu, a leader of a father's house among the Simonites. And the name of the Midianite woman who was killed was Cosbi, the daughter of Zur. He was head of the people of a father's house in Midian. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Harass the Midianites and attack them, for they have harassed you with their schemes by which they seduced you in the matter of Peor, and in the matter of Cosbi, the daughter of a leader of the Midianite, their sister, who was killed in the day the plague because of Peor." So because the Midianites had attacked Israel by the schemes of sexuality or immoral sexuality and idolatrous seduction, the Lord is calling Israel to bring an attack against them in return. And you'll find out further details in a couple weeks as we go through the chapter 31 in the book of Numbers. But to wrap up here, we looked at Israel's harlotry with the women of Moab. We see their unfaithfulness and sexual immorality. And we see God's judgment upon those who offended here. And we see that 24,000 people die as a result. And we see among this madness of thousands of men and, Midianites, all that stuff, we see one man that stands out for righteousness against the immorality. And we should not be surprised if indeed the rabbi is right about the Israelite man and the Midianite woman having sexual intercourse in front of the tabernacle and defiling, the area. And, after all, if that is true, they did it at the tabernacle, it shouldn't surprise us. I mean, look around your neighborhood, especially up here in New England. We got Universalists, Unitarians, whatever they're called, and other liberal church groups that hang rainbow flags, and they promote the love is love slogan. They get rid of the Bible. They don't care about the Bible. They welcome that immorality within their churches. So overall, the fake churches are bringing homosexuality acceptance and LGBT into their congregations by saying love is love. And when one stands for righteousness, it makes a difference. And it might not be the most comfortable thing. There's going to be persecution in the church for those who stand on what God has said in His Word. And so it can make a difference as with one person that stands in the tide of sin around us. And that's why I am blessed to see others who go out to these abortion clinics as well and preach the gospel and speak against the evilness of that as well. And we see God honored Phinehas for his zeal, for his passion for the things of God. And the chapter ends with a call of command by God for Israel to make it a bad day for the Midianites. He's calling them to harass them and attack them. And I want to wrap up with one passage here in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and looking at verses 6 through 11. But the Apostle Paul, as he's speaking to the Corinth church, which is a church with many issues, as you can see throughout his letter, he references the passage that we go through today. And in verse 6 through 10, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they have lusted. And do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink, and rose up to play. Now let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. Nor complain, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. So the Apostle Paul, he is reflecting on the book of Numbers here when he confronts the idolatry and the sexual immorality that also affected the Corinth city of the church. And as Christians, we must guard ourselves against the sin of Baal Peor, which is sexual immorality and idolatry. And, so Baal is among the American church today in our communities. They accept the things that go against God. They accept sexuality that is not from God. And I know John MacArthur spoke out against sexual immorality with homosexuality and everything, and YouTube deleted his sermon from January 16th when the many churches, thousands across the United States that were faithful, took a stand to make their voice against this ridiculous law of Canada that's threatening churches to not be able to speak out against such things and to, tell people that they're in the wrong when they're living immoral lives. But I don't care if YouTube removes this video. This is the truth of God and God's word, and I'm going to stand by God's word, whether people like it or not. So tonight's not as calm of a message, but we have to speak out against sin and the things that go against God. So I hope this video has been a blessing to you tonight. We'll be back tomorrow night. We're going to push through another chapter in Numbers tomorrow. I know Saturdays, many times I do topical videos, but we're going to push through the genealogy, or the census of Israel. So we're going to look at the census tomorrow, make it as short as possible. So I hope you have a great rest of your night. Have a great weekend. God bless.